record, can you please say and spell your first and last name?
It's Sy, S-Y, last name of Ray, R-A-Y.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Can you tell us how it is that you're employed?
I'm self-employed as a consultant, primarily consulting on criminal cases as it pertains to criminal investigation methodologies and tactics, as well as geolocation involving mobile devices.
And do you testify for both and take cases for both the prosecution and the defense?
At 99.9% prosecution and that 0.1% defense.
How did you get involved in the area of criminal investigations and tactics and geolocation data?
I actually started in law enforcement. I started my law enforcement career in '95 as a reserve patrol officer. Became certified through the state of Arizona in 1996. Started with a pretty small agency, SHOLO, S-H-O-W, space L-O-W. Police department, and I stayed there until '99. In 1999, I transferred to a larger department, the Gilbert Police Department, which is a suburb of Phoenix. I worked primarily in an investigations role at Gilbert. I started in child crimes and sex crimes, eventually moved into robbery and homicide, ultimately becoming the sergeant and the supervisor over the robbery and homicide unit. I was with Gilbert PD until 2014, and in 2014, I actually started a company that provides law enforcement with both training and software to map and analyze cell phone records.
And what company was that?
Name of the company was ZETX, Z-E-T-X.
And in terms of providing that cellular mapping and geolocation data to law enforcement agencies, did you build a software program in order to do that?
I did. It started through a lot of training and experience going back to my law enforcement days. The first time I worked with cell phone records was in 1997, where I actually got a set of phone records from AT&T and incorporated them into a criminal investigation. If you kind of think about that timeline, 95 to 2014, my career just happened to align with cell phone technology. So it was pretty obvious early on how cell phones can be used in criminal investigations, and just kind of timed my career with that very well. In the early 2000s, I began receiving training. Back then it was directly from the cell phone carriers, so Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and I started working almost every investigation I did, we included some type of cell phone analysis with it. That merged into cell phone tracking, of actually going out in the field and finding cell phones. Our agency had purchased very sophisticated, very expensive equipment that would allow us to go into the field and physically find a phone. Like, we know it's in this house, in this particular bedroom. In order to do that, I received an incredible amount of training both in radio frequency technology, network technology, and analyzing cell phone records. Because our agency was very progressive in doing this, I had a lot of success with early cases that other agencies would call and ask for training. And I started teaching this subject matter in 2007. In 2010, I had kind of developed somewhat of a name for both the company and myself. I'm still a police officer at the time, and I was actually asked to go over to Afghanistan to do some work in Afghanistan, kind of in the same field, more on the criminal investigation side, but also exploiting cellular devices. So I took a leave of absence, came back in 2011, and at that point went back to our police department. Pretty much spent the rest of my time at the police department just tracking phones. That was my entire job. When I started in '95, if we got a set of phone records with a dozen phone calls, that was quite a bit back then. By 2012, 2013, if we got a set of phone records for a 24-hour period, we could have several thousand connections. So the volume of these records had dramatically increased, and there wasn't a software or any type of an analytical program that I felt was mapping the geolocation value where the phone could potentially be. So in 2013, I started writing a software program while I was still a police officer to use as a police officer. And this allowed me to analyze the records using the software program and then go out in the field and physically find the phone or find the person attached to the phone. So I had some ways to self-validate there. By 2014, I realized I was onto something. I had a lot of agencies asking to use this program. So at that point, I retired from law enforcement and started the company full-time. We continued the training. So we've trained to date probably 35,000 police officers, both in the United States and around the world. We built a lot of different databases that can help law enforcement in tracking cell phones, cell tower databases, other databases that allow law enforcement to take these very complex records, put them into the system, and make sense out of them, visualize them.
And after that, did you actually sell your company?
I did. In 2021, our company was acquired by a much larger company by the name of LexisNexis, L-E-X-I-S-N-E-X-I-S.
And then did you stay with that company for a number of years in a particular director role?
I did. As part of the acquisition and some knowledge transfer, I was required to stay with them for 2 years. And at the time, I was a director analyzing different types of technology that could benefit the overall platform that they offered to law enforcement, as well as providing some guidance in that knowledge transfer of the ZEDX program.
What kind of a company is LexisNexis?
LexisNexis is a really big company, so there's different departments. Everybody's probably seen the save 15 minutes on your car insurance. When you put all your information into that Geico app, it runs your data through LexisNexis servers that basically verify who you are, what your history is, and that's how they know how to provide you with some type of a bid because they know who you are. So think of them as a very, very large clearinghouse for public data. They also offer a number of tools specifically for law enforcement for investigations. They're about 30,000 employees in size, so it is a very large corporation.
I apologize.
LexisNexis also provides various forms of databases, materials, and assistance for the legal profession as well, correct?
Sustain.
All right. So they involve, you said they're involved with global information analytics and things of that nature.
They're owned by a company out of the UK that's more on a global scale, but LexisNexis predominantly is a US-based company providing US-based services.
Okay. So with respect to all of the information you've provided us on your expertise, have you also testified as a subject matter expert in these areas on numerous occasions?
I have. I've testified as an expert probably just a little over 100 times now. That's in both state and federal courts throughout the United States, probably 25, 26 different states, to include multiple places in California as well as LA County.
Okay. And based on all of the information you gave us, what is it that you start out by looking at when you take on a case?
As it pertains to the cell phone data, there's a lot of talk that people will hear about extractions and the physical examination of the phone. What I specialize is more of the phone records that are kept and maintained by the carrier, AT&T, Sprint, Verizon. So we will get as large of a data set as we can possibly get, and what I mean by large is the date range. We like to get 6 months to a year, and we'll literally map all of those connections, and sometimes it can be hundreds of thousands of connections. The software that I built allows us to essentially hit a play button, and we can watch every cell tower that phone connects to over a course of time. And what we will start to see is a pattern developing of maybe somebody going to work Monday through Friday. When they sleep at night, the phone is always in the same place. If they go on vacation, if they take a day and go to the beach. So when I refer to pattern of life, that's the first step, is getting as much of the data as we can and then mapping it to understand the pattern of life. And a lot of times, I don't even want to know about the case at that point. A lot of times, investigators can get tunnel vision, that they look for a specific day.
So,
They'll look at a specific day, so in this case, January 23rd, when the pattern over the last year is really more relevant than the day itself. So it's really important to understand that pattern of life. A really good example of that is Could be looking at a bank robbery suspect who happens to be at the bank at the time of the crime. But if I look at 6 months worth of data, he's there every week because he works across the street. That's pattern of life and how it could impact a criminal investigation.
Tell us a little bit about your training and experience regarding the technology of cellular networks, which you just started to mention, as well as the specific type of data that you talked about that you're interested in, and what is mapping of that data.
So when I first started, there wasn't training available. I started a lot of the training that started in the United States when I started teaching this in 2005, 2006. So my early training was from the network engineers with the providers. So I would work with network engineers from AT&T or Verizon or Sprint, whoever I was working with. When our agency purchased that equipment to track cell phones, then I started working with radio frequency engineers to better understand the network, and that's where I received the training at that point. And ultimately what this training entails is the ability to look at cell phone records, see how a phone is connecting to a cell site, potentially what side of that cell site, and then be able to form some type of estimation of how far away that device could be from that cell site. And by understanding and analyzing that, when I say mapping, it gives us the ability to look at these individual connections and have a rough idea of the geographical location that that device is in at a particular time. So over time, as we animate this, we can see movements.
So do you actually have databases based on your training with the actual engineers from the cell phone companies that goes back for a period of time?
We do. That was something that was very unique to the ZX platform, is we support every type of record the phone companies in the United States provide to law enforcement, regardless what it is. So we're intimately familiar with the type of records out there. The whole selling point to this program is any detective or officer could get any type of record from a carrier, drag and drop it into our system, and our system would be able to automatically analyze it. So we had to create software that would support all the different record types. To date, that system has mapped well over 2 billion phone calls in the United States. We have databases with literally hundreds of millions of connections, and we use that to better understand what we're seeing in the records, how we can improve our products, understanding and estimating the distances I was talking about before. It's all used to continue to perfect the product.
And you also said that you began training others somewhere around 2005, 2006. Was that within the law enforcement community in order to assist them with their investigations?
So ruled.
Yes, I was getting more and more requests from other agencies to explain how our agency was showing some success with this type of an investigation. So I created a 3-day class that later turned into a 5-day class. That's the class that, between presentations I've given and the actual students attending the class, like I said, probably 35,000 law enforcement. But it's not just law enforcement. We provide classes and have provided classes to prosecutors, to defense attorneys, as well as defense experts.
In terms of that instruction, do you also provide expertise, as you mentioned, to law enforcement or defense counsel or defense experts in cellular tracking and data analysis?
Yeah, very commonly after somebody attends any type of a course or a presentation, I almost always will get half a dozen or a dozen requests immediately following to help them with cases. I would say over the last 10 to 15 years, I've consulted on thousands of cases across the United States, both for defense and prosecution. This is probably a really good example. I provided a training course for the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, and in doing so, I ended up with this case. So that would be essentially how I got involved in this particular case.
Okay. And have you also published, or has your work been published in various sources?
We have, and when I say work, there's a couple different ways we can look at that. Obviously, I've testified a number of times. My casework and my testimony has been published for a number of different reasons. It's actually pretty easy to Google. Additionally, we've had some white papers written both on other people critiquing and looking at our program, as well as individuals endorsing the program. So we've had both scientific papers written, as well as we have gone to great lengths to publish our methodologies, as well as the algorithms and formulas we use within the software, right down to actually putting it on YouTube as a training video.
When you talk about white papers for individuals who are not in the scientific arena, what is a white paper?
Typically a white paper is where a third party will come in and look at some type of a scientific process, and they will evaluate it based on a matter of different things depending on what their goal is. We've had that done both for somebody who corroborated the way, and we've had that done with people critiquing the way. We've also had a professor, I believe with Purdue, evaluate the program and include it in a book that he wrote. So we've got several publications that have to do with the performance and the reliability of the program.
All right. Now, were you asked to evaluate evidence in this case regarding the defendant, her prior co-defendant, Robert Baker, and more recently another individual by the name of Christopher Austin?
I was.
And approximately when did you begin work on this case?
In February of 2020.
Okay. Could you tell us what exactly you did when you started out?
The first thing I'll do is ask for as much data as I can get, kind of what I explained earlier. I'm going to refer to some notes I have here just because there's a lot of phone numbers and I don't want to transpose numbers. So in this particular case today, looking at the defendant's phone records that were available, looking at the victim's phone records, looking at Mr. Baker's phone records, eventually incorporating Mr. Austin's phone records into that, looking at another individual known as Mr. Birdsong's records, as well as a number of other phones. I want to say there was 25 different devices that had some type of phone records that had been obtained. There's over 40 different phone records, so some of those devices have multiple sets of records. I want to say 200,000 locations that I had to analyze through that. So the first part of this was just getting all of the location data, mapping it, and then going through that process of looking at patterns of life.
And within that 40 different sets of call detail records and the 25 different phones and the 200,000 plus mapped locations, were you also asked to look at the fact that the defendants in this case used multiple different phones, including burners, and that some of those phones were never recovered?
I am very well aware of that.
By looking at what you said, the analysis of the patterns of life or call patterns, were you also able to, by developing those call patterns, analyze the interactions between various individuals involved in this case?
I am. That's part of the pattern of life, is as we see the device moving around, what is it doing? Is it communicating with an individual? Is it communicating with multiple individuals? And at that stage, I start to incorporate the pattern of life with other known facts. I'll call it corroborative data. So that's when I'll reach out and ask whoever I'm working for surveillance video, for point of purchase sales, for any type of police reports. And I can start to go back and now piece together, hey, I'm seeing this phone go to Los Angeles International Airport on this day. What do you guys know about flights that day? And that's that corroborative data of starting to show the accuracy of the cell phones, but also why these phones are moving where they are.
Okay. When we talk about corroborative data, we're talking about, are you referring to other independent evidence that would confirm what you see, let's say, through the CDRs or your data analysis?
Yes, and that's not limited to any set types of data. Anything that could help us put a date, time, and a location together is what I want to look at. So these could be photos on a phone that was taken from an extract, financial records, an ATM withdrawal, a surveillance video somewhere, a purchase at Target. Anything that the investigation has revealed, I want to look at and be able to put it on the map. Something just to be really clear about with all of my testimony today, I can only testify to what the phone is doing. The big challenge in court is I can't always tell you who's using that phone. So that's why this corroborative data is so important, is can I start to match a pattern of life to a person based on that person's known spending habits and financial records and surveillance cameras and maybe vehicle movements. So that's why we look at the corroborative data.
Okay. To be able to potentially, from things such as surveillance video like we've seen in this case, be able to put the phone in someone's hands.
Literally.
Okay. You said that you reviewed numerous records. Did you review anything else? Including, let's say, cell phone extractions that you referred to.
I did. Cell phone extractions present some problems with geographical data. Sometimes it can be manipulated, sometimes it's not as accurate, but we still want to look at that. More importantly, we can start to see photos of certain events, messages of certain events. This would also include app interactions. So whether it's a cellular extract from a phone or potentially looking at somebody's cloud data. So iCloud, for example, if you have an iPhone, a lot of the interactions of your phone can be stored in the cloud. So in addition to the extract, we want to look at the iCloud account. And a lot of times we can glean what somebody is doing with their applications on their phone with that.
Okay. So those would all be, again, other independent means by which you could validate or corroborate or confirm what the CDRs or cell tower data might tell you.
Correct. At the end of the day, my testimony needs to be accurate. So my concern is coming in and testifying to just what I'm seeing in the phone records. I may be looking at the wrong phone. I may not be looking at the defendant's phone, even though it's in her name. So as much of this data that I can get to ensure that the phone records I'm testifying to is matching the person that we're talking about is extremely critical in these investigations.
All right. Did you look at phone records, including call detail records, for both the defendants? I'm sorry, for the defendant, as we talked about previously, the defendant, Monica Sementilli, and her prior co-defendant, Robert Baker.
Yes, Monica's phone, the primary one that I looked at was actually an AT&T phone, and I typically just refer to the last four to keep it short, but it ends in 4213.
And with respect to Mr. Baker, did you look at Sprint records regarding a cell phone number that ended in 1093?
I did.
Did you also look at Robert Baker's burner phone for communications that he had with Mr. Austin that ended in 2168?
Eventually. I didn't have those initially, but later on, as things started to get pieced together, yes, I also looked at those.
And did you look at phone records for Christopher Austin, his regular phone that ended in 7486?
I have.
And his burner phone that ended in 1929?
I have.
And again, did you review phone records for over 1 year period in order to try to establish, as you mentioned, a pattern of life and connections between individuals?
On what I'm going to refer to as the two primary phones, and that would be that of the defendant's ending in 4213 and that of Robert Baker's ending in 1093. Some of the other data sets didn't have as much data. Some of them were missing tower information, so we can see dates and time and who's calling who, but it would be absent of tower information. But when we start looking at the analysis of over a year, it was specifically to those two phones that I performed the analysis on.
Okay. So the short answer would be yes as to the primary phones. Obviously, when we talk about burner phones, sometimes the whole point of a burner phone is that you're using it for a shorter period of time.
Correct. The data sets are usually much smaller with those.
And why is that?
I should probably say it's kind of a false idea that a burner phone hides your identity. Your name isn't associated with the account necessarily, but it's very easy to find burner phones and who's using burner phones, so don't use burner phones. But typically when people think of a burner phone, it's a temporary solution to communicate to somebody else with this alleged thought of, I'm going to be anonymous. People aren't going to know it's me. Because it's typically done, in my experience, on a temporary thing, it's rare for us to see people use the same burner phone over a period of time. If for some reason somebody's engaged in some type of behavior that they think that anonymity is really important, we'll actually see them cycle through burner phones because they think that gives them even further anonymity. So every 3 weeks, they're switching to a new phone, new number.
But if you have that, again, an individual who is cycling through multiple burner phones, could you also, again, be able to corroborate or validate a particular burner phone or number associated with a burner phone based on the fact that they're calling, again, the same individuals they've used on prior burners?
That pattern of life, when you take your burner phone home every night, it kind of makes it obvious where it goes every night. Surprisingly, we can actually get a lot of information on when and how the phone was purchased. With a little bit of work, it's easy to identify burner phones. And I don't want to say burner phones are just something we see with criminals. Burner phones are something you can use just to hide your interactions with your spouse or loved ones. So it's across the board. I hear a lot of times people say burner phones are associated with criminal activity, and it's not. The burner phone market is probably more to deceive your spouse than commit a crime. But they are out there. They're used on a very regular basis.
And when you were in law enforcement and throughout the years since regarding this field that you're in, have you found that people who commit crime or are planning crimes typically will use burner phones in order to hide and conceal their communications?
They will use burner phones. They're usually not very good at hiding and concealing those communications. But yes, the prevalence of burner phones in the course of committing criminal acts is fairly common.
Did you also review Viber records in this case regarding the defendant and Robert Baker?
I did. Viber is a app that you load on your phone. The value of Viber, at least as it pertains to this case, is it's an end-to-end encryption. And what that means is the content of the message, what I send you, it isn't being sent in its full content. It's being sent in an encrypted format. So those communications are protected. You can't actually decipher what the communication is unless you have the device that sent or received the message and has that encryption code. Viber itself doesn't even store the actual content on servers. It's only looking at the encrypted content, which technically Viber can't even unencrypt. So it's a way to communicate with people by hiding the content of what is being seen. We still see, I sent the prosecutor 6 messages, she sent me 5 messages, but we won't see what we're saying in those messages.
So, and also, if an individual, let's say, were to delete the Viber application, would that also delete, as you said, unless you get the actual phones, the content of those messages?
So overruled.
If I do not delete the content of my messages on my phone and law enforcement seizes that phone and they do an extraction, they would be able to access the content because they're getting it directly from the phone. If I delete all of that content prior to that, then law enforcement would not be able to access it. It just doesn't exist. I should probably throw a caveat just in case there's clarification later. You can also push that content to a cloud service. And in that case, where it may not be on the phone, it would be in the cloud. And it's rare, but we have seen that on occasion as well.
Not in this case, correct?
Not in this case.
And when, again, you were in law enforcement, have worked with law enforcement over the years, have you ever seen, based on your experience and expertise, where law enforcement's able to recover the content when Viber is utilized?
If it's not captured directly from the phone or from a cloud service, there is no other way to get this content. You can serve as many search warrants on Viber as you want. Viber doesn't store that content, so there's no way to get it through a third party if you're not getting it from the physical place that it's stored.
And with respect to another application, WhatsApp, is that a similar type of encrypted communications application?
Almost identical. Different names, different companies, but almost the exact same operating systems.
Okay. So therefore, the same things we talked about with respect to Viber would also apply to content with respect to WhatsApp?
That is correct.
All right. And in this case, did you determine that the defendant, along with Robert Baker, were using Viber to communicate prior to the murder?
In reviewing the Viber records that were provided to me, yes, a lot.
That, we'll get into that, that Viber was never used after the date of the murder. They suddenly stopped using Viber on January 23rd, after that date.
That is correct.
And that after that date, they switched to using this other encrypted application, that being WhatsApp.
That is correct.
Did you also look in this particular case at location information or data from cell towers and other sources?
Yeah, that would be what we were talking about earlier. Looking at that pattern of life typically is going to come from cell tower connections.
Did you also look at, as we talked about, the cell phone extractions, but also surveillance videos and stills from surveillance video and other photographs?
I did. Both that were recovered from surveillance systems as well as pictures and videos recovered from the devices themselves.
Okay. Also, did you look at financial records?
I have.
Did you look at flight airline manifests and records?
I have.
Point of purchase records?
Yes.
What's a point of purchase?
I go to Target and buy some clothes. When I swipe my card at the kiosk there, it's the point of purchase. It's going to capture that on my card and give us a date, time, and amount.
So in other words, it would give you specific data like you would get perhaps from surveillance video or photographs, like metadata.
Correct. We get a specific location at a known date and time. We don't always get the time. In this case, we have some ATM transactions. We don't capture the time on ATM, just the date and the location. But it can still corroborate what we're seeing in the phone records.
Can you give us maybe like the Reader's Digest version of how you get location information from cell site records?
So when your phone is communicating to the network, and it can be a text message, a phone call, data, or just while you're sitting in court with it powered on, the phone companies maintain records of those connections. By us analyzing those connections, sometimes we might be looking at GPS data that's giving us a physical latitude, longitude with a range of accuracy. Sometimes we look at what's referred to as timing data, and that tells us how far the device is from a particular tower and what side of the tower the device is on. And then sometimes we just have tower connection. We know the device connected to a particular tower and has to be in range of that coverage area of that tower. So when we get these in the records, we can see up to thousands of connections per day of that type of data. We put it into a mapping software, and then we can go through and actually look at the movement of a device over time.
And does cell site records differ depending on the information that you glean from them, differ depending on if you're in, let's say, a rural area versus an urban area such as Los Angeles?
Yeah, so what we were talking about there is what we refer to as tower density. The more dense the network, the more people that are in an area, more cell sites. As they put up more cell sites, those coverage areas get smaller. You move to a very rural location, those cell site locations get fewer, the coverage areas get much larger. Some examples in this case is, yes, Los Angeles is very dense. At LAX, though, we're going to see a much smaller footprint of coverage than we will in Woodland Hills. If we drive to Las Vegas, halfway between here and Vegas, very open, we may see coverage areas that are 10 to 20 times the size of what we see in Woodland Hills. There's also some records in this particular case that are along the Las Vegas Strip. Extremely small coverage areas because we're looking at some type of an antenna that's actually inside of a casino or inside of a building that just primarily covers that building.
And did you also include in your analysis information that would come, let's say, from drive test scanners?
We did. So part of building ZEDX, let me back up to what a drive test scanner is. A drive test scanner is very sophisticated radio frequency survey equipment that we deploy in the field. Think of it driving a big grid pattern through Los Angeles. It's capturing all of the signals, the signal strength, the signal quality of all of the cell sites in the area. That allows us to do a forensic examination of that data and physically map what a coverage area of a cell site looks like. With ZEDX, we have built a tower database with over 3 million, I think at this point, maybe more, of those drive test scans that are in that database. And what that allows us to do is reverse engineer the way that the networks are working so that we can start to estimate coverage areas. And we've become increasingly accurate at doing so. It's still an estimation. It's never going to be 100%, but our accuracy is in the 90s, about 94 to 96% accurate.
Do law enforcement and cellular companies use that type of data regularly?
Yes, the source data that we're talking about isn't anything we created. That is a industry standard both within law enforcement investigations and network engineers. What we did that was very unique is try to build a database throughout the United States where if you give us a tower and a side, we can give you that range estimation. And that in itself was very unique. That's one of the primary reasons LexisNexis moved to acquire us.
Did you also review the defendant's browser history?
I did. What was provided to me. When I say browser history, I can see bits and pieces of it, usually through the phone extract. I will not in any way claim that I've seen all of browser history. So yes, but it's very piecemeal just by nature.
And what type of information did you glean from that regarding pattern of life?
With the browser history?
Yes.
Depending on what part of that we're looking at, sometimes we can see Wi-Fi connections. So we may see that the phone is in the general area of somebody's house, but then we can look at the browser history. Sometimes within that history we can see Wi-Fi connections and confirm, yeah, they're connected to their home internet. So they are in their house. We can also see different things that they may search for. So a really good example that'll be relevant to this case is, I don't know what I want for dinner. Hey, honey, what do you want for dinner? And now there's a conversation, and we can see a husband and wife at the same time searching for faux restaurants and the address associated with the faux restaurant. So that's the type of thing we'll see in browser history where we can actually see what people are physically searching for.
I need to confer with all counsel momentarily. Let's take our lesson recess at this time till 1:30. The admonition applies. Not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else in the form of expressing an opinion to the cause. It's when I submit it to you. Have a good lunch. I'll see you at 1:30. If I can have counsel remain, please. Mr. Ray, so under oath, and the people may continue.
When we broke off at lunch, we were talking about the various types of data that you reviewed in this case. What of interest relevant to what you mapped in this case did you find in the defendant's pattern of life data?
There was a lot. Probably what stood out the most is going to be the ongoing communications with Mr. Baker. And they were, in my experience, extreme.
What do you mean by that?
I would say for the last year leading up to the homicide, close to a year, not quite a year, we were seeing communications over 5,000 a month between them, whether it's text or phone calls, the combination. And that's not counting the Viber connections. We were unable to look at the Viber records prior to January 1st of 2017. So we really have no idea how much Viber was used. We can get an idea, which I can talk about later, but we can't put an exact number on it. But easily 5,000 times a month, they were just texting or calling each other.
Okay. And did that level of communication that you referred to as extreme suddenly stop at any given point?
There was a sharp decline for sure on January 23rd of 2017. It did pick back up about a week later, but there was a complete stop for a couple days, several days, starting around the time of the murder through the next week.
And did their patterns of communication, in other words, when you looked at the communication between them on each side, the defendant and Robert Baker, did their patterns mirror each other?
Close. It's actually kind of typical of what we see in a lot of relationships. He texted her a lot more than she texted back, but she would call him a lot more than he would call her. That's pretty average with what we see in relationships like that, but the sheer amount was enormous.
Did you prepare an exhibit that displayed the volume of communications between them?
Yeah, I added a couple of visuals just some of explaining the Viber can be a little bit challenging if you're just hearing it opposed to kind of seeing the chart of what it looks like. So I had some graphs and some numbers that just kind of help it tie together and make a little bit more sense.
You want to write a set of charts, 9 pages in length. May this exhibit be marked, please, as People's Exhibit 255?
Yes.
Thank you. Looking at what's been marked now as People's 255, and this is page 1. There's a 1 in the lower left corner in red. Can you explain to us what we see here?
Objection on that presentation.
All right.
1 of Exhibit 255. Can you describe for us what we're looking at here on this key?
Yeah, this is just to help keep some of the terminology. We're going to talk about different ways you can communicate, whether it be by an application or through your phone directly. So just making sure we're all on the same page. SMS is a text message. SMS means short message service. MMS is a text message that includes a picture or a video. Instead of the short message, it's now a multimedia message. So that's why we have this phone call. Can technically happen through this voice internet protocol, but we don't see it as much. The technology's changed. And then voice over IP. If you hear me talk about anything VoIP related, certain apps allow phone calls to be made, but it doesn't use the classic voice network that you would think of calling AT&T and Sprint. It's an actual application that uses data. So voice over IP is the internet protocol that's being used.
Looking at page 2, what have you charted out for us here?
This is just putting some of the context together when I said the communications were enormous. What we're looking at is October 1st through June 14th. The communications between the defendant and Mr. Baker didn't start until December, so I used the October 1st date because that's when the record started that we had for the defendant. And what we're looking for is from October 1st to June 14th, what do we see in all these records that we can start to see their communications? When I broke out all of her communications through her phone records, her communications with the defendant or with Mr. Baker, whether he's calling or texting her, she's calling or texting him, it made up for 49.8% of all of her communications. And kind of to put that in context, if you took all of her messages to her husband, her children, her friends, everybody else in her life, she communicated with Mr. Baker as much as everybody else combined. So that's when I was saying it's just an enormous amount of communications. When we look at the actual numbers, it's 16,462 communications. And remember, we can't see the Viber messages until January. So we have about 9 months of Viber records that I can't tell you how many times they communicated through Viber. And then down at the bottom, I mentioned this earlier, I was asked a question like, did they mirror each other? They're very similar, but you can see that, again, the defendant preferred to phone calls compared to Mr. Baker, but Mr. Baker looks like preferred text messages, and that's where we see those numbers off just a hair.
So again, whether we're talking about communication via phone call or via text, we're talking about an extraordinary amount of communications.
Objection on that.
Correct, and I want to make it really clear, I cannot comment on the content of these communications for the overwhelming majority. Every once in a while we will see a little bit of content that we're able to find through a different source, but I can't tell you who's talking, what they're talking about. It's just on their devices.
Looking at page 3 of your charts, what does this indicate?
Yeah, it's just to make sure everybody's tracking. I put the date October 15th because that's when we started looking at the start date of the records that I had, but I want to make it really clear. I could not find any contact between the defendant and Mr. Baker prior to December 14th of 2015, and that's when I could see, at least through their devices, some back and forth messages start to be exchanged.
And what did you indicate here at the bottom?
When you break out these communications by time, the majority of them happen in the evening, typically between 9 p.m. and midnight. So one of the things we like to look at with pattern of life is, do we see this at certain times and certain days? Could it indicate some type of a work relationship? Is it just on the weekends? Those little details we look at to help further the investigation. And this one, when I was looking at that, it's pretty much every day, but the majority of the communications were later in the evening.
Looking at page 4 of People's 255, what did you indicate here in this chart?
So I was talking about the Viber records, and what I want to show here is we know that there was a handful of communications in December. Here I've got 10. In January, we see that number of 10 grow to 188, and in February it's up over 5,000, March is 7,000. Then we get to April and we see 2,600. And then you can see the rest of the year significantly drops off. The defendant and Mr. Baker both downloaded the app Viber in April. And where we see that peak at 2,600, as soon as the Viber app is loaded on both of their phones, we see these text messages almost all but stop because all the communication has now been moved over to the Viber platform.
Okay. And in terms of using the Viber platform in April of 2016, does that also coincide with when Viber went to end-to-end encryption?
Yeah, so what we're talking about there is Viber had a release. It's their version 6, and version 6 was highly publicized in the first part of 2016. It was well anticipated, and it was in April of this year that April of 2016, that Viber released their version 6, which included the end-to-end encryption. So it would be at the time that they started to download this app and started to use it.
So when you give us a number such as in February of 2016, 5,786, that's the amount of communications between them just for that month, correct?
Correct, whether it be a text message or a phone call.
And the same is true of the other months, such as March, where we have almost 7,200 communications just in that month alone.
That is correct.
Moving on to page 5. What did you include here with respect to your analysis?
So we have some of this through browser history we talked about earlier. We also have the Celebrite extracts. And what I'm showing here is the data usage that we're looking at as far as what are we seeing with, as we look through this, and let me kind of explain. It's hard for us to see some of the Viber data. But when we look at data usage, we can see that when the Viber application was installed, that data usage increases. There was also some other apps that were really prolific in the defendant's usage that we could see data spikes that would match it. So when we look at the Celebrite extract and we can see some of this activity happening within the phone, and then we can see the data that's happening, the daily consumption, if you will, of that data, we can start to get an idea of what type of data usage we're seeing. I can't tell you what all that data usage is for. I can just tell you what the pattern is consistent to when we have all of the data.
When you said that she had prolific use of certain applications, which ones are you referring to?
The Viber use for sure. There was another one called Lifestyle Lounge that was accessed multiple times, almost daily.
And what is that?
It is a dating application.
Looking at page 6 of Exhibit 255, what did you chart out here?
Yeah, so it's kind of more of the same of what we're looking at. You can see that we see the regular data communications in Sprint leading up to April 11th, and then it all but stops. And again, this is when we look at the Celebrite extract, we know that the Viber app was downloaded. We know that these other apps that are going to start coming up a little bit more frequently in her usage, and it's just showing that there's a clear difference that when that app is loaded on her phone, how we see her daily communications.
Showing you page 7 of Exhibit 255. What did you chart out here?
So I said earlier that we can only look at the true connections of Viber for the month of January 2017. That's all that law enforcement was able to obtain. And when we look at that, we see that just in January, between January 1st and January 23rd, there was a total of 5,789 messages exchanged. The one thing that I could tell in all the Viber records that I've been able to find, whether it's on the phone through the Celebrite extract or whether it's the records that came from Viber, they only communicate with each other with this app. So it's not like I see text messages to her kids and her husband and then Mr. Baker. It's just messaging back and forth between the two of them. If we look at what that breaks out to, the 5,000, there was a question earlier, do they mirror each other? Baker messaged the defendant in this time period 2,749 times, and the defendant messaged Baker 3,005 times. There's also some VoIP calls included in there, and earlier I said you can use the Viber application to actually make a call. And we can see that Baker called the defendant 6 times, the defendant called Baker 26 times.
So in this particular chart, the defendant is both calling and messaging more so than Baker is.
Correct.
Showing you People's 255, page 8. What did you indicate here?
Yeah, it's just my summary slide. And this is where I was talking about before. When we see that drop off on April 11th to really very little, if any, communication through the more historical approach of just using your cell phone, and we look at the data connections, we can look at the January that we do have the Viber records, look at the data connections we're seeing, and now go back previously to those other months where we don't see this communication after April 11th, and it's very consistent. So it gives us an idea that this Viber app is being used consistently throughout the year.
And lastly, looking at page 9 of People's Exhibit 255, documentation or a chart with respect to the usage of the home surveillance camera application, IDMSS Lite. What does this show?
So this is kind of a combination. Notice that the numbers have changed pretty dramatically on this graph, and what we're looking at on the far left side, that's the amount of information that's basically being downloaded for a particular session. The bigger the number, the more somebody's looking at a video stream. And what I was trying to map here to look for is, do we see any pattern of access to the surveillance application on the defendant's phone where we can say, hey, on the 23rd, if the defendant accessed the surveillance camera, is that really significant, or is that something she does every day? If you do it every day, it doesn't mean anything that she did it on the 23rd. So what I'm mapping here is when I'm seeing access to that camera, and over the course of a little over a year, actually it's just under a year here because we stop it, we can see that the access that she has on 1/23/2017 is fairly unusual. It's not like this isn't something she accesses daily on a regular basis.
So the last time that we see that she accessed the application to view her cameras remotely prior to the day of the murder is what? December 31st of 2016?
No, it actually would be November 10th. But the usage was relatively small, a very small usage at that point. And prior to that, it would have been September. So we see 2 accesses in August, 1 in September, 1 in November, and then not again until the 23rd.
Of January 2017?
Correct.
All right. Now, did you review any data regarding the defendant, her husband Fabio, Sementilli, the victim in this case, Robert Baker, Austin, and Al Birdsong, relative to the time of July 2016?
Not so much before July, but definitely in July.
And what did you note in July of 2016?
So first I should probably explain why it's an anomaly. Seeing the 4 of them, and just to recap, Robert Baker, Monica Sementilli, Fabio Sementilli, and Christopher Austin. Seeing the 4 of them, or at least their devices, in the same area at the same time is extremely rare in these records. So it's fairly obvious when you look at all the records, we see all 4 of those devices in Las Vegas on July 24th. When we break into July 24th a little bit more, there is definitely a very unique pattern that comes out. Just before 11 a.m., so at 10:59 a.m., we see a phone call where the defendant calls Mr. Baker. When that call is made, the defendant's phone is using a cell site that is actually located right next to, possibly on, actually bolted onto the Aria Hotel. I can't say she's at the Aria, but she's in very close proximity. Earlier we talked about those small coverage areas. Las Vegas has a very small coverage area on the Strip. Mr. Baker's phone is just to the west. And when I say just to the west, his phone is using a cell site that's probably 500 meters to the west of the Aria. So we see that phone call, and then after that phone call, we see Austin's phone show up in the same area, actually using the same cell site location that Monica's phone received that phone call from. His phone is very active between about 11:13 to 11:50, and it stays in that area. So we know that from what we can see there, we have Baker, Monica, and now Christopher Austin in close proximity. I can't tell you they're in the same room. I can't tell you they talk to each other, they're in each other's presence, but their three devices are in very close proximity of the Aria. What really stands out here is Mr. Sementilli's phone is not. It has moved away from the Aria, which it had been there the entire previous day, and had moved down to Mandalay Bay. And looking at his itinerary and some of the things that were going on with this trade show, beauty awards that he was emceeing there was an event at Mandalay Bay that was associated with some of these other events at that time. So it appears that when Mr. Sementilli's device moves from the Aria down to Mandalay Bay, we see Mr. Baker's, Mr. Austin's, and the defendant's phone is all in general proximity to each other at the Aria.
And you said just before Mr. Baker and Mr. Austin's phones go to the same area where the defendant was at the Aria, or in close proximity to that, there is a phone call from the defendant to Robert Baker.
That is correct, and that's, like I said earlier, it's right at 10:59, so just before the 11 o'clock.
Would that be consistent with her giving him her location so they can meet up?
It could be.
And when you said that this is a very unique pattern, would it be fair to say you did not see that pattern again during any of the records that you reviewed?
With one exception, the other thing that was of interest to me when reviewing this is Baker and Austin are going to leave Las Vegas on the night of the 25th, early morning of the 26th. They're back in Los Angeles the morning of the 26th. The defendant flies back to the 26th on the 26th as well. She arrives around 1 p.m. to LAX. Fabio is going to stay until the 28th, so she does come back early at the same time, well, just a few hours after Mr. Baker and Mr. Austin come back.
So she returns back to LA approximately the same time, or at least on the same date, July 26th, that Baker and Austin returned back to the LA area.
The closest I can get you with the records we have is within 6.5 hours. They're all back in Los Angeles.
Okay. Whereas the victim in this case, Fabio Sementilli, remains in Las Vegas for another couple days.
Correct.
All right. Now, did you create a presentation of slides that depict what you observed in the records from January 22nd of 2017 through January 23rd of 2017? I
did.
Your Honor, can I have that marked as People's Exhibit 256? And I believe that's going to be contained on People's 156.
You're not marking 256 at all? Or are you?
It'll be on 158. No.
So
I guess I don't need to, but I need to make a record that it's going to be added to the flash drive.
That's fine. There's no 256.
Correct.
Let me take a short break. Nobody moves. Christine's ready to come out. You okay?
Oh, she's ready to come out.
Take about 2 seconds.
Thank you. Okay, so if we could move over to your second slide, and if you could describe for us as we go what you see.
So essentially, we're just going to look at a couple of phones. We've talked about a lot of different information. At times, I will add some of that information in, but for the most part, what you're going to see on the screen is the geolocation, the movements of these devices. And there's three that we're going to look at. The defendant's phone that I said earlier ended in 4213. It's an AT&T phone. Mr. Baker's phone, which is Sprint, ends in 1093. And then the deceased, Fabio Sementilli, also AT&T, ends in 0463. I put the crime scene just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. You'll see that there's different locations that will come up as we go through there that'll be mapped and actually identified. As we start to do this, you're going to see a lot of information on the screen. It's easiest to follow by color, so I've assigned a color to each of these three phones. Mr. Baker will be, anything you see in red on the screen will belong to Mr. Baker's phone. Anything you see in blue will belong to the defendant's phone, and anything you see in green will be associated with the victim's phone. I'll have a little legend that pops up from time to time, so just so everybody's tracking, Mr. Baker's red, the defendant is blue, Mr. Sementilli is green.
So what do we see here that you found from the records?
We're going to start on January 22nd at 6:20 to 8:40, and this was something that jumped out very, very early in my analysis, just because it is somewhat unusual, and we're going to see Mr. Baker leave the area of his apartment. I can't say he was at his apartment, he's close to it, around 6:30. He's going to drive down to Los Angeles International Airport, arriving around 7. He's going to leave there around 8. He'll return to the area of his apartment by 8:30. Obviously, the resulting investigation at this point revealed that Alaska Airlines, that arrived at 7:34, had Mr. Austin on board. So this is just putting that all together so that we can actually see how that worked. It's also a good slide for everybody to kind of get used to what we're going to be seeing. So as we start here, you can see the location is the general area of where Mr. Baker lives. Red is associated with Mr. Baker. I've got an address here of his apartment. That red shaded area, that's that estimated area I was talking about earlier. I can't say the phone is 100% within that red shaded area, but it's going to be very close. And we can see this first connection that we're going to start with is at 6:23 in the morning, so that would be AM. And then shortly after that, we'll see a couple more towers light up here, moving to the south. Then we're going to see that move over towards the east here a little bit. So by 6:27, the reason I'm showing these times, if he's in the area of his apartment at 6:24 and now he's moved south, you can kind of gauge he's probably moving away from the apartment at 6:24. And then we can see all those other connections coming down the freeway to the south, eventually leading to LAX. Like I said earlier, he arrived at 7 a.m. and this phone is going to remain stationary there till just before 8 o'clock. So he arrives early and he's just going to kind of hang out in that area.
The red circled areas,
Correct.
what do those represent?
That's the general area that he's at while we're looking at this.
Okay.
What we're looking at now is I was talking earlier about this corroborative data. When the Alaska Airlines information was found out about the itinerary of Christopher Austin, we found that he lands at 7:34 at LAX. And this was a flight, it's a red-eye flight, so it left at midnight from Anchorage, had a connecting flight in Seattle, and then ultimately arriving at LAX at 7:34.
Where do we go next?
The next thing we're going to see is the phones start to move slightly away from the airport, and that's going to be right around 7:50. And right after that 7:50 period, we see it move back to the north. And ultimately, we're going to watch it go all the way to the north, returning back to the general area of Mr. Baker's apartment. Like I said before, I can't tell you he went to the apartment. He just landed in the general area of where his apartment is located. And we see that he makes it back over there around 8:30. I think it might be 8:34.
And this is the apartment on Independence.
That is correct.
What do we see after that?
The next thing we're going to look at is, I had mapped this early. So I'd mapped this in 2020. I can't say that there was anything significant that caught my attention prior to some recent developments over the last 3 or 4 months. However, since I already mapped it, I received some information in the last few months. Hey, can you go back and look specifically at some times in the afternoon of the 22nd, and can you tell us where everybody's phone is on the 22nd? So in doing that, I found between 3 p.m. and 6:05, there is some interesting activity. Mr. Baker is going to receive a phone call from the defendant at 3 o'clock. The call is going to be about 2 minutes in length. Immediately after receiving that call, Mr. Baker is going, or his device is going to leave the area of his apartment, and it's going to go over to 19548 Ventura Boulevard. That's at least really close to where the cell tower is located. I can't say he's at that address. He's just in the general area there. We're going to see the phone stagnate. What I mean by stagnate is with the information, the data we have available, the phone is only going to use cell sites in that general area over the next 3.5 hours, at which point it's going to leave and return back to his apartment. At the same time, when I'm seeing this information, I'm looking at the other data we've been talking about. There is some significant activity through the Viber application between the defendant and Baker at the same time. So this is just going to visualize all that together. So it'll start here with the phone call. I remember blue is the defendant, red is the Mr. Baker, and we can see that Mr. Baker is receiving an incoming call from the defendant's phone number. This is right at 3 o'clock. On Baker's side of the call is 2 minutes and 12 seconds. You notice there's blue on the map there as well, so we actually see the outgoing side of this call on the defendant's phone. The defendant's side, the AT&T captured it as a 2 minute, 3 second call.
And is that typical that because companies keep records differently between, like, let's say AT&T and Sprint, that they might show slightly different time ranges?
Correct. Different records will, the way they connect, the order in which they connect, and they're registering to the network, they can be off by a couple of seconds. So just because I called you for two minutes doesn't mean your records wouldn't show a connection for 1:55 or 2 minutes and 6 seconds. It's very common. There was something else, though, that I had seen in the data overall that is interesting to me as we see this route to this area on Ventura Boulevard. And I think it's Tampa, right off of Tampa there. There's a cell tower, and I'm going to highlight it with my mouse right here. It's the little one off to the furthest one to the right up here. That cell tower is in an intersection with a Chase Bank ATM is located. In Mr. Baker's financial records, there's an ATM withdrawal on the 22nd. I can't tell you, because we don't have the time, I can't tell you that is when he stopped to withdraw that money, but it is one of the only times I've been able to find that his phone is in very close proximity to an ATM Chase throughout that day.
Your Honor, I have a Chase Bank transaction detail report for the date of January 22nd of 2017. The address is 19, I believe it's 323 Victory Boulevard in Reseda, and it looks like it is, it posts on the 22nd and appears on the transaction detail on January 23rd, followed by a photograph and a map. May they be marked, please, collectively as People's 256.
Yes.
Thank you. Showing you a Chase Bank document relating to an ATM withdrawal on January 22nd at this address, 19323 Victory Boulevard, for $120. Is that the transaction that you're talking about?
It is.
Okay. And with respect to this location, 19323 Victory Boulevard, is that consistent with the cell tower data that you have, you just had on the screen just before I switched over to this?
It is. There's one of the cell sites that Mr. Baker's device uses is literally in the same intersection. It's located very close to this ATM.
Okay. Showing you People's 256, and this has a 1 in the lower left corner. Is this the location 19323 Victory Boulevard?
It is then, anybody was to research it today. It's changed, but back then, yes, this is the Chase that's on the bank account.
And at the time, this Chase Bank was next to a grocery store, that being a Vons, as we see here in this photograph.
That is correct.
If we look at people's 256, there's a 2 in the lower left corner. Does this show us the location of the Vons store and the Chase Bank with relation to the defendant's apartment?
No, it shows it
Oh, I'm
with
sorry.
relation to the faux location on Ventura.
And that's a place that was called Faux California at the time, located at 19548 Ventura Boulevard in Tarzana. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Correct. Okay. Back to you.
So as we continue here, the next zoom, you're going to see 1524. That's 3:24 California time. So if we think about that call coming in at 3, 24 minutes later, Mr. Baker's device has moved into the area where that faux restaurant is. And just for the record, it's going to get marked on the map here so everybody's on the same page. It's like this L-shaped plaza right here. It's in the corner of that L. While this is happening, so I'm looking at the Viber records at the same time. Mr. Baker's device arrives in the area at 3:24. From 3:34 to 6 p.m., we see quite a bit of Viber activity between the defendant and Mr. Baker. There's 69 Viber messages that are going to go back and forth in about that 2.5 hour time frame. So at the same time that this phone is going to stagnate in that area, we're going to see significant text messages going back and forth. Can't tell you what they say, but there's transactional history showing that they happened. If we look at the browser information, we talked about this earlier today, there's some interesting things that are going on with both Fabio's phone and the defendant's phone, where we see at 5:11, Fabio is searching faux near me, and that's literally in quotations what is searching. At 5:12, he sends the defendant an instant message. I can't tell you what that instant message said. We didn't capture the content, but I can see that it's sent. Right after receiving that instant message, Monica searches the actual address of that faux restaurant, 19548 Ventura Boulevard. At 5:41, we see the defendant actually text one of her daughters confirming her order would be fried rice. During this time period, 5:11 to 5:41, we see 17 Viber messages alone just in that time period between Mr. Baker's Viber account and the defendant's Viber account.
17.
Correct.
Okay.
I'm going to pause one other area here really quick. Sorry, I just want to catch it before we lost it so we don't start over. I was asked at the same time of all this other information specifically, and I don't know all of the issues of why this is relevant, but hey, is there a Vons and is there a Ralph's in the general area? The Vons was next to Chase. You guys have already seen that. It should be pointed out here, and you can see it right next to the cell site that is lit up with the red circle around it. Literally kind of catty corner in that intersection. There is a Ralph's located right there. Again, I can't tell you that they went to the Ralph's. I can't tell you they went by the Ralph's. But the phone at some point during this evening, that 3:30 time frame to 6, Mr. Baker's phone is using a cell site that's located right next to the Ralph's. It is about 3 business complexes down to where the faux restaurant is located.
What's the next thing that we see?
So we have green that popped up on the screen, and this is Mr. Sementilli's device. We can see at 6:03, he's got a data connection. AT&T data connection, I need to explain something really quick. Very unique to AT&T. When that phone connects to a cell site for a data connection, it will hand off to other cell sites and other sectors, sides of cell sites, throughout that connection to maintain the connection. So we're going to see this initial connection is on the cell site that's located right next to the faux restaurant. But as it zooms out, you're going to see a gray overlay. Gray represents handoff. So the first connection is on the west side of that cell site. The next connection is going to be on the east side. What that tells me is that phone is arriving in the area and is still probably moving right around 6:03, 6:04.
So what you're telling us is that we first see the defendant searching the location 19548, you said, through her browser history, and then subsequent to that, Fabio Sementilli, the victim on January 22nd at 6:03, connects to a tower near that same location.
That is correct.
Then what happens?
We don't have a lot of activity on Mr. Sementilli's phone after that. At some point, he's going to leave, and I can say he pops back up around the area of his house later that evening, but I can't tell you when he leaves and when he arrives based on the phone records. It does appear that Mr. Baker's device is going to stagnate in that area to about 6:45, at which point we see it return to the apartment complex.
Okay. All right. And then from here, do we move on to the following date?
We are. So we're starting. I'm sorry, hang on. All right, we're going to start here in the morning of January 23rd. And just by way of context, I'm just looking at the first activity I can find that morning, and we see a Viber message at 6:50 in the morning from the defendant to Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker is in the general area of his apartment. Mrs. Sementilli is apparently somewhere in the area next to her house. I can't say they're at their house, but it's consistent with them being in that general area.
Okay.
As we start to go forward in time, and we're just going to keep going forward throughout the 23rd, we're moving forward now to about 10:50, and it doesn't look like either device has moved. They're still in the same area. But throughout that morning, we've seen quite a bit of Viber activity. So between 8:33 and 10:53, there's roughly 25 messages back and forth here between the defendant and Mr. Baker. And it is back and forth, so it's very consistent. Somebody sends a message, receives it, sends it back. Sends a message, receives it, sends it back.
Between which time period, the 25 messages?
8:33 in the morning to 10:53 in the morning.
Okay.
We continue to move forward in time. At 10:55, there's an outgoing call from the defendant to Mr. Baker's device. Mr. Baker's device is still in the same area, but we're going to talk about something called timing data here in a minute. Because of the timing data, we can tell that this phone is moved, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. The reason I'm mentioning that is this call is at 10:55. It does not connect to Mr. Baker's phone. So there's an attempt on the defendant's phone to make this call. It's not received on Mr. Baker's phone.
Okay.
Timing data is where we can actually see the distance from the cell site the phone is located. It can be very accurate at times. And I have a new icon that just came up for Enterprise Rent-A-Car. And when we look at the distance measurement we're getting from Sprint from the cell site to the mobile device, it's the exact same distance as that Enterprise sits from the cell site. Additionally, we can see the time that a vehicle was rented that I've been told has been associated with Mr. Baker, and that vehicle rental was at 11:01, and that's the out time, or what's captured as the out time.
And that's a Enterprise rental car located at the address shown on the document to the left, correct?
21330 Sherman Way, Chinoga Park, California.
Okay. What's the next thing that we see after Baker at this particular location?
Just to associate the times that we're talking about, I'm going to show the activity that we were looking at with this particular timing advanced is at 10:55. So when we see that that phone is the exact distance it is to the Enterprise is at 10:55, and 11:01 is what the receipt says. So it's logical to assume that is exactly where the device is. This is just going back to that corroborative data, showing the accuracy of the mapping and that we can have some reliability to what it is we're talking about here.
Okay. What's the next location that we see him at?
We're going to start to see some movement here, and this is consistent to the defendant leaving her residence and traveling to the gym. And I've actually highlighted what that route would look like. And the highlighting of that route is also kind of confirmed with some of the surveillance video where we can see the vehicle leaving the neighborhood that the house is located in, and then we can actually see the defendant arriving at the gym. The handoffs that I was talking about before, we have those in this case, and we can kind of see the handoffs kind of give us a breadcrumb trail of that route. So in this particular case, we can get pretty close to saying this is the route she traveled on or very near to travel from point A to point B. And this is going to be at 11:49 is when she arrives at the gym.
When you say handoff, you're talking about the connection on her phone being handed off from cell tower to cell tower as she moves, correct?
That is correct. And then shortly after that, the next thing that happens here is we see Mr. Baker's phone also move into the area of the gym. That's at 11:56. And again, that cooperative data, we actually have Mr. Baker walking into the gym. Looking at that cooperative data, it's just relevant. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this already too much. The description of what Mr. Baker is wearing is also very important to this analysis because we're going to see more of this later. And that is going to be at 11:59. Going to move forward now to 12:48. So we went from 11:59 to 12:48 roughly. We moved forward about an hour in time. Mr. Baker's device is still in the general area of the gym, and we can see that he's now leaving. The time there is 12:43. Still wearing the black sweatsuit with like white stripes. When he goes out the door, it's 12:43:17. In a moment, we're going to see the defendant exit as well. Just remember that 12:43:17. At 12:43:16, the defendant leaves, and we can actually still see Mr. Baker's feet outside on the sidewalk. So she is literally leaving seconds behind him.
And what is the next thing that we see here?
We're going to see that travel route back to the Queen Victoria house. However, on the way, when the defendant leaves the gym, the defendant's device makes a phone call to the victim. So we can see an outgoing call to the victim at this point, and that's going to be at 12:49. And then after that call, we see the rest of the activity that indicates that that device is going to leave and actually return to the Queen Victoria house or close to. There is surveillance video again of the same vehicle entering the neighborhood. And the point of showing the surveillance video here is that the surveillance video, these times we're seeing these device movements, is lining up with the records perfectly. So earlier I was saying it's very rare that we can say this person has this device, but we're starting to see patterns with both of these devices at this point that they're traveling with everything else that we're seeing with the cooperative data. At this point, we're going to see that Mr. Baker's phone has returned to the area of his apartment. I can't say it's inside, it's close to. The defendant's device has returned to the general area of her house, and they're stagnant there for a while. When I say a while, I'm looking specifically at a time period between 1:20 and 2:43, and this time we have roughly 30 Viber messages that are exchanged back and forth during this time period.
So in about an hour and 25 minutes, we
Correct.
have the 30 Viber messages.
That is correct.
Okay?
Going to keep moving forward in time. Going to slow down some of these Viber connections as we start to go through this, and we're going to put a target now. So we've added the location of a target. Kind of see the overlapping of the two red circles at the bottom that kind of makes a little football shape in between those two cell sites. The target is located right in the middle of those two. And what we're seeing here is continued Viber messages between 2:45 and 3 o'clock as Mr. Baker's device is moving away from his apartment towards the target. Ultimately, we're going to see Mr. Baker arrive at the target. And again, just looking at that cooperative data, the phone arrives at the target in surveillance, the same time the phone records show it arriving. So we're starting to get this that whenever we see Mr. Baker in the phone records, it's matching at the surveillance, the rental car. We're getting a good feeling that Mr. Baker is the one traveling with this device on this day. The last Viber message, if you can see it on the screen, is at 3:01. The time of the surveillance of the vehicle arriving at target is at 3 p.m. So a minute before the last Viber message on this screen. You see this individual walk across the parking lot towards the target. You're going to notice the black sweatsuit with the same white stripes we saw earlier at the gym. Actually walking inside the target now, it's 3:02. So just as we kind of go through this time stamp, remember we're moving on from 3:02. See another series of Viber messages between 3:10, 3:11, and 3:13. And at 3:19, we see Mr. Baker leaving. Appears he has a cell phone in his left hand as he's walking out there.
Looks like he's carrying maybe a bag in his right hand.
Correct. Now, when he goes to move here, it is hard to see. I'll be the first one to admit this. But if you follow it very closely and you watch this, he doesn't actually leave the parking lot. He's going to move to the back part of the parking lot, and he's going to park that same car in a place in the very back part of the parking lot, and then just wait there. And we've moved forward in time now to 3:24.
When you say waits there, are the phone records consistent with Baker remaining at this point in the target parking lot?
It is. Moving forward to 3:26, we see the victim's Ford F-150 is leaving, but we see Monica's device is moving at the same time. So even though it appears to be the victim's vehicle, the defendant's phone appears to be inside of it because we can see multiple handoffs again that track with other surveillance of it passing the Ralph and then eventually arriving at the target. And I've got a little yellow line that represents that. At the same time of leaving the little guard shack there by the neighborhood, going by the Ralphs, arriving at target, we're seeing Viber messages at the same time back and forth between the defendant and Mr. Baker. There's somebody standing. I cannot tell you who it is. It's too far away to identify it. But there's somebody standing in the parking lot by a little store that's back there. And when the Ford F-150 arrives in the parking lot, this person appears to walk up to the Ford, and then I can't see that person anymore. They ducked down behind a car and low crawled out of the parking lot, got in the truck, or just evaporated. I can't tell you. But when the truck moves, that person is no longer in the screen.
And again, do the cellular records indicate that Mr. Baker is still at the location?
Mr. Baker is still there, and we know that the defendant's device just arrived. The vehicle Mr. Baker is driving is also still there. The Ford F-150 is going to park for a brief period, about 4 minutes, almost 5 minutes, in the back part of that parking lot. The devices, it is consistent with both devices being there. And as we move forward, you'll see some red flashes. I'm going forward in time, and you can see that red phone is still in the area. Ultimately, we're going to see some movement here. I cannot see people interacting, so I can't tell you what's happening there. But the vehicle, which Mr. Baker was driving earlier from the Enterprise, is circled in green. It's going to leave the parking lot, and we're going to see F-150, the dark colored F-150 is going to move to a different parking lot or a different parking space closer to the target, and then we'll actually see the defendant exit and walk into the target. And this is going to be at 3:35, so we move forward in time to 3:35.
Now, between those 4 minutes where the defendant is parked to the back of the lot before she moves her car to the front of the lot near the store, is there any Viber communications between the defendant and Baker, given that we know he's still in the lot?
No, the next Viber message just came on the screen at 3:36. So as soon as she is parking her vehicle and we see the rental vehicle begin to leave the parking lot, that's the next Viber interaction that we get. Going to see a message come up here that's going to, it's an outgoing call from the defendant's phone to Jessica's phone. So we see that there's a call being made. It doesn't connect on the other side. We can also see at that same time Baker is still in the general area, and now Baker's device is moving off to the east. And we see that at 3:38. After that, that device is going to be turned off. We're not going to see it for a couple of hours.
When you say turned off, what do you mean by that? Like he switches his phone off?
I can't tell you he powers it off or puts it into airplane mode, but is no longer communicating with Sprint's network. Around the same time, 3:38, we see the defendant has now exited her vehicle. So when she parked, she actually stayed in the vehicle for a brief period. There was the Viber message, then the call to Jessica, and then there was the text message. So after that, we see her exit at 3:38 and now walking towards the target. As she enters the store here, you can see that she's carrying her cell phone. She's going to get a shopping cart. When she comes back with the shopping cart, you can actually see her holding her cell phone in her hand, or a cell phone in her hand. And her right hand that's kind of up on the cart right there, you can see what appears to be a cell phone. That's going to be at 3:39, so we've moved forward in time to 3:39. Mr. Baker's device has just been turned off. Well, it's no longer creating any records that we can see location. I can't tell you the moment that it disconnects, but it's no longer connecting. Let me back up there. We actually missed that. At 3:40, so right after we see that last clip where the defendant walked off with the shopping cart, at 3:40 she sends a text message through Facebook Instant Message to her daughter saying, "Don't be late to babysitting." The daughter's going to respond saying, "I won't, LOL." Shortly after receiving that, 3:47, we can actually see her daughter is now leaving. So text message, "Don't be late, I won't be," and she leaves. At 3:53, there is information. Sorry, let me go back to that. At 3:53, there is a connection from the defendant's device to that ID. Sorry, let me pause this. The IDMSS Lite application accessing the surveillance system at the house. At 4:18 is when we see the two individuals that are jogging up the street and enter the neighborhood. Moving back to the target. It's 4:31 now, so we've gone forward slightly more than 15 minutes. We're going to see the defendant is going to now come out of the target. She's on her phone at this point. If you watch carefully, you'll actually see she kind of, I think, loses track of where she's at and has to redirect to the front door. But she's actually using her device at this time. Moving to 432, she's now exited the store, going back to the vehicle.
When you reviewed the extraction for Fabio Sementilli's iPhone, did you note whether or not he had that same application for the home surveillance camera system on his phone?
I don't recall. I want to say yes, because I think I don't recall the application itself, but I do recall a message he had received about accessing it when it first got set up.
Yes, but after that, did you note that he did not have that particular application downloaded onto his phone?
So,
I don't recall, like I said earlier, ever seeing it. I'd have to go back to confirm that.
Okay.
By 4:38, the defendant has left the target.
The lot.
Correct. Driving eastbound, and we're actually going to see that same vehicle get picked up on surveillance by the Ralph's surveillance camera. That's at 4:41. And then she's entering the store by 4:42. At 4:46, she's going to send a message to Mr. Baker via Viber, and by 4:52, she's leaving the store. At 4:53, we see the black Porsche leaving.
Just before 4:53, the black Porsche leaving at approximately 4:50, did you note that the defendant deleted the Lifestyle Lounge application from her phone?
I did. There's actually a handful of things that get deleted at that time, but the Lifestyle Lounge is one of the things, correct. By 4:56, we can actually see that Porsche passing the Ralphs, and by 5:03, we see the 150 arriving back in the neighborhood. At 5:14, there's another Viber message, and then we see Mr. Baker's phone is finally going to register back to the Sprint network. We see that it's moved from the last location. It's back just north, kind of northeast from the residence. That's going to be at 5:12. From here, we're going to see that it's going to go back up towards the apartment. I can't tell you he went to the apartment. I'll just tell you it's in the area of the apartment, and that's by 5:30.
So what's at 5:12?
The phone comes back on.
Okay.
As we start to move forward in time, we're actually going to see the phone moving off to the east. This is going to be around 5:46. Right around the same time, there is a traffic stop of the rental car, which Mr. Austin was identified as the sole occupant and the driver. So that is consistent with what we're seeing in the phone records of now Mr. Austin being in the vehicle that's tracking with the phone. So whether the phone is in the vehicle or the phone is following in very close proximity, Mr. Baker's phone and Mr. Austin are tracking very close to each other. So we continue to move on. Oops, sorry. Moving on to about 6:10. Now we can see that phone stagnated there for a little bit for the traffic ticket. We're now going to see that device move off to the east, kind of northeast, and it's going to land in this industrial center. Realize it looks like just a bunch of red overlays. This is one of the early things that I was able to pick up on when I was analyzing the Sprint records. The only thing that I could find in that area that was open at this time that really would do anything where you would just drive across town, drive right back, is the flyaway. When we look at the financials with Mr. Austin, it aligns with the LAX shuttle for the flyaway. So this is when Mr. Austin is arriving at the flyaway to take the shuttle back to LAX.
What time is that? 6:27?
I believe so, but let me look. 6:30 is when I have activity up there. The precise time he gets out of the car, I couldn't tell you, but I do have the flyaway. I don't know if it gives us a time, though, on the financial side.
Okay.
And that's the end of it.
All right. And subsequent to that, did you note that Baker then returned home to his apartment later on that evening?
Yeah, there's some movement around the area. He actually goes out to the east a little bit later in the evening. I would say by midnight, that phone is at the apartment for that evening.
Consistent with his pattern.
It is.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Let's take our afternoon recess at this time for 15 minutes. The evidence implies. See what happens in 15 minutes. The defendant is present, all counsel present, jury and alternate present. Mr. Ray, you're still under oath, and Mr. Jones, you may cross.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I wanted to first talk about just one aspect of your PowerPoint presentation. And actually, I'm just going to go to one slide if you're able to bring it up on your computer.
You know which slide? Which slide?
Slide 10, please. This is the video, just before you play it. This is January 22nd, 2017, is that right?
Correct. Looks like it's going to start right around 3 o'clock.
In the afternoon on that day.
That is correct.
The red circle, that is Robert Baker's device, correct?
Yeah, and it might be hard to see on these TVs. There's actually two red circles. There's one right here, and there's one right here. These are off of data connections. And then this bigger red shape that we see, that's the voice call.
And at the moment, at 3 p.m., it's consistent with his device being at his home address, right?
In that general area, yeah, the Independence Drive.
All right. Do you mind just playing it, and then I'll tell you to pause it if that's okay?
Sure.
So there, 3 p.m., consistent with being around the area of his home address.
Correct.
Is that right? Just keep it playing. Just keep it playing, if you don't mind. We then see it move. The device is connecting to various towers along the way.
Correct.
And it then is connected to a tower that's consistent with being the area of the Fur restaurant, right?
Correct.
Just play it and just pause and when that is. That's at 3:24, correct?
That is correct.
So Robert Baker's phone his device is connecting to a tower near the Fur restaurant at 3:24 p.m., right?
Correct.
Keep it playing. That's the restaurant, correct?
Correct.
You just keep it playing. Come back to this. Keep it playing. His phone, his device, you said it stagnates. Is what you mean that it stays in that area?
In that general area,
that
correct.
general area.
I'm not saying it's at the phone. I'm saying it's in the area.
I think you said it stagnates, stays in that general area until 6:45 p.m. Is that right?
Roughly, correct.
So, Robert Baker's device is seen first entering into the general area of Fur restaurant at 3:24 p.m.
Correct.
And it stays for 3 hours and 20 minutes, roughly,
Correct.
until 6:45 p.m. Right?
That is correct.
And you don't see it connecting to any other cell towers or leaving that area during that 3 hours and 20 minutes, right?
No, I feel very comfortable it's in that general area. There's enough activity that keep in mind we're seeing it in glimpses, right? We don't get a constant stream. So I did look, hey, what's the longest period of time that we see no connection at all? It's just under 30 minutes. So is it possible he could have driven in that dark out time from his house back to the apartment or somewhere else? Maybe, but it's probably an outside chance.
So very comfortable with his device in that area for that whole time, 3 hours and 20 minutes.
Within the parameters that I just explained, yes.
And then Fabio Sementilli's device, you can play it, but that arrives, I think, at 6:03 p.m. Is that right?
6:01, but yeah. Yeah, 6:03, you are correct.
All right.
Are you good with that one?
That's it, actually. I just wanted, the other thing that you stop it or let it play out. You said that from 3:34 p.m. to 6 p.m. there are 69 fiber messages exchanged between Monica Sementilli and Robert Baker. Did you?
Correct.
That's shown on that slide, right?
Correct.
And you said there was quite a bit of Viber activity, yes?
Guess it depends. If we're talking about 14-year-old girls, maybe not, but to me, that's a lot.
Looking at that day as a whole, January 22nd, 2017, there are multiple messages sent between them at all times throughout that day, aren't there?
Yeah, well over 100. I'm guessing here. We can go back and count them. I would say at least 150 throughout the day, maybe more. And that not throughout the day. We need to put a hard stop. Right around the time of the murder, there are no more Viber messages.
It may help. Your Honor, I have counting up of all the messages from the Viber records for the days throughout January 21st, 2023. If I could mark this as defense exhibit 622, I believe. Yes. Mr. Ray, showing you defense exhibit 622. Just switch over. And this is showing an adding up of Viber text messages and calls in a total for each day. Do you see that? Follow that?
I do.
And you see for January 22nd, 180. Does that sound consistent with what you notice?
Sure.
All right. So there are multiple messages that day, not just those 69 in that period, correct?
Correct.
And there are messages in the morning, at midday, and after that period, right? Correct. And that day, it's not out of the ordinary compared to other days in terms of messaging, is it? There's many hundreds of messages being sent each day throughout January, isn't it?
Well, objection when there's no foundation.
Sustained.
Well, you've looked at the Viber records for the month of January, haven't you?
I have.
And isn't it true that they message every day in January?
They do.
Isn't it true they send multiple hundreds of messages a day?
I made a mistake on that last one. We're saying the month January. There are no more messages after January 23rd. But between January 1st to January 23rd, you are correct.
They send from January 1st to January 23rd messages every day to each other.
That is correct.
Hundreds of messages a day, every day.
Except for the 11th.
Except for the 11th.
Correct.
I want to go now to what you were shown by the People's Exhibit 255. Showing you this.
Okay.
Showing you, let's start with, showing you page 2. Actually, I'm sorry, let me just, I'm going to situate this and just clarify something so we're all following along. This is the timeline of AT&T communications. Is that right?
Correct.
And it goes from December 2015 all the way to June 2017. When Sementilli was arrested. I believe so, yes. It starts here, December 2015, because that's when you see the first communication between them, correct?
That is correct.
In terms of devices, right?
Correct.
And then what we have here are the SMS messaging and calls using the sort of normal phone SMS calling function. Is that fair to say?
The regular network text messages, yes.
Not Viber.
Correct.
Okay, so just looking at these, it's all of this, but the concentrations here in these ones, right?
Correct.
And going back, you had a sort of analysis of just these AT&T communications. This is an analysis of those communications, right?
From October 1st to June 14th, you are correct.
Yes, and October's when you start looking at the records, but as you said, they don't actually start communicating until December, right?
Correct.
Okay. So we see here, this is communications from Monica Sementilli to Robert Baker. And this is communications from Robert Baker to Monica Sementilli, correct?
Correct.
So there are SMS messages and there are calls. The SMS messages make up the vast majority of the communications, don't they?
I would agree.
And here, it's Robert Baker who is sending the vast majority of the SMS messages to Monica Sementilli, 2/3, correct?
Correct.
He's sending double the amount of messages to her that she's sending to him, isn't he?
Correct. 2/3.
And you're absolutely right that she does make more calls to him than he does to her, but this is making up a very small amount of the communication, isn't it? It's only in 2.51% plus nearly 1%, so it's only 3.51% of their communications.
Well, those are connections. I wouldn't agree with it makes up a very small part of the communications, because if you and I were having this engagement by text message, we probably have a couple thousand text messages by we get done, but we could do it in one phone call. So I would say we can't per se put a account on what's happening in those communications, and typically we would see a lot more communication from a single call than we would maybe a dozen text messages. So I don't want to say there's less communication happening there, but there's less connections, if that's what we want.
So going back to, this is page 4. I think you're trying to explain that it drops off in April because there is, you can see that a Viber is being downloaded, correct?
Correct.
This is timeline here. It's showing much fewer communications via AT&T records, the SMSs and calls, throughout the months after April, correct?
That is correct.
January here, so I just want to look at this timeline. That is the only month that you have the Viber records, correct?
That is correct.
And I think you said, which one of these slides, the Viber records for that month, this is now page 7, 5,789 communications in that month, correct? So they're sending, in January 2017, almost exactly the same amount of communications as they were nearly a year prior in February 2017, right?
Say more.
But also 3 more.
It's 5,789 compared to 5,786.
But we're also talking about 28 days compared to 23 days. So I would say if we looked at the daily average, it is more. Plus we have to add the 56 other communications there.
But then looking at this month, March, there are a lot more, aren't there?
There are.
And that's why you say that the messaging they were doing February, March, April, using normal communications, is consistent with the amount of messaging they're doing in January of Viber, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
They're sending just about as many communications in January 2017 as they were nearly a year prior, correct?
I would refer to that as the tempo, and yes, I would say the tempo on the volume of contacts is very similar from everything I've seen throughout the year.
And these intervening months, we just don't know how many Viber new communications were sent for those, do we?
We do for February, March, April, May, and June of 2017.
So I talked about Viber messages.
From February to June of 2017, we know there are no Viber messages.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant these intervening months.
Just in 2016.
We only have Viber records for January 2017, correct?
Yeah, but we know there's no Viber records in existence for February to June, so we can say there's nothing after January. There is no Viber records.
All right, just looking before,
Okay.
you don't know how many Viber messages were sent. We know Viber is being used from April to January 2017, correct?
Correct.
But we don't know how many Viber messages were sent in this period I'm highlighting here, from May to December 2015, do we?
You are correct.
It could be an amount consistent with these figures in the SMS text messages from February to April 2015, couldn't it?
Could be the same. It could be more. It could be less.
You just
we
don't
don't know.
Right. Just 1 moment. Actually, have no further questions, John.
Any from other people?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ray.
Thank
You're
you.
excused.